Hello, I hope that you all are having a wonderfully informative conference. Allow us to begin by introducing ourselves and providing you with a brief background. Hi, I'm Dawn Ingram. I'm an online instructor with University of Phoenix. I have facilitated courses for them for over a decade in the online format. I earned a master's degree in education from Florida State University and am working on a second master's in psychology from University of Phoenix right now.
I'm Gary Grimm, and I'm also an online instructor with the University of Phoenix. I facilitated a variety of courses for the school and for a number of years in the online format. I earned a master's degree in history from Forte State University. Go Tigers! Today we will be speaking about considerations for post-secondary ADA accommodations. Don and I both have seen numerous students pass through the classrooms, all with accommodations of extended time. One day we were discussing whether this was a one-size accommodation or if there were more factors to consider for accommodations for students at the college level.
The Americans with Disability Act, or Public Law 94142, was signed into law in 1975. This law initially was designed to support accessibility to education, but the law has since been revised to include outcomes, with the goal being for students with disabilities to not just have access to the same education as their non-disabled peers, but also to comparable outcomes. For example, a student who is blind should have the same accessibility to textbooks that a sighted person would have.
Accommodations are changes that are made to the general curriculum to not modify the rigor in any way, but to support the student with disabilities to have the ability to reach the same outcome as the non-disabled peers. Extended time, more frequent breaks during testing, books written in Braille, e-readers, separate classrooms for assessment, a scribe, and organizational support are some examples of accommodations that can be provided to students. The intent of accommodations is not to provide the student with unfair advantages, but instead to level the playing field. The idea is that the accommodation, although needed for the disabled student, would not be advantageous to non-disabled students. For example, if a non-disabled student was presented with a Braille textbook, no additional advantage would be provided. This rule of thumb for accommodation is titled the interaction hypothesis. This hypothesis states that any accommodation would benefit non-disabled peers as well as disabled. Is not a true accommodation. An illustration of what is legally required that is helpful is in seeing the intent of the law is in the PGA tour. There was a golfer named Casey Martin who wanted to ride a golf cart to play on the tour. This was against the PGA's rules, and they denied Mr. Martin's request. He eventually won his case, noting that the accommodation was necessary for him to play on the tour. His claim was that this did not give him an unfair advantage, as his access to a cart would not change what was necessary to compete in the tournament, which was the ability to strike a golf ball. If this illustration is carried over to the field of education, what should be offered as an accommodation should be just enough to allow the disabled person to compete equally with any other student. A challenge would be how to determine what that accommodation needs to be on an individual basis.
Just as disabilities are unique to the individual, a careful and unique approach is needed in order to actually fulfill the mandate to provide reasonable accommodations to students with special needs. Steele argued that there is a difference between access skills and cognitive skills. Access skills are the ability to access different arenas of assessment and learning. For example, a student with anxiety may not have access to the SATs in a large group setting due to the nature of their disability. Allowing this student to take the same assessment in a smaller setting will allow this individual access to this assessment. Cognitive skills are the skills actually measured by assessment. For example, math, reading, and writing are all cognitive skills. While disabled persons need full access to testing, they are being tested on cognitive skills such as the ability to access information previously learned and reasoning skills based on prior knowledge. The impact of their needs regarding access skills should not prohibit them from demonstrating and understanding of cognitive skills.
Extended time is one of the most common accommodations provided for students with disabilities at all levels of education. This allows the students to be provided with additional time to complete a task. The benefit of this accommodation, however, is not clearly evident. In the average class setting, it is not always clear that the student seeking an accommodation has been diagnosed stringently enough to determine the kind of accommodation that will work best. When using extended time as an accommodation, the law reminds us that only a change that is just enough to give the student equal access and opportunity to the question is required, rather than a standard for the school, that is, a rule that states that all students requiring an accommodation at an institution receive a set amount of additional time. The standard, according to the law, should be just what is required for that particular student. This accommodation can be implemented in any way specified to the student's individualized educational plan, but common practices are either to provide the student with a specified quantity of time, such as double the time provided for disabled peers, or can be provided as agreed upon by the teacher and student.
A review of literature reveals that a considerable amount of study has been devoted to extended time for timed assessments, such as state tests and the SATs. However, the review also reveals that relatively little attention has been given to how this accommodation applies to classroom use, other than the acknowledgement that it should be provided. Providing students with extended time on assessments can benefit students who require time for organizing thoughts, anxiety, and health impairments that impact stamina. Many times, this accommodation is provided as a standard accommodation without the data to prove that this specific accommodation meets with a particular student's needs. Overall, students with disabilities do benefit from extended time on accommodations, but their non-disabled peers also reaped a similar benefit on standardized assessments with accommodations. So, a question arises: is extended time as an accommodation a true accommodation, or per the interaction hypothesis, is it an actual modification to the assignment?
Steele suggests that since most tests are computer generated, it should be easy to adjust the additional time to suit the individual needs of each specified student. However, the question becomes, how do we assess the variables of each student and translate that into a percentage that could be used to adjust the extended time given?
There are several factors involved with making a determination of whether a student requires extended time as a modification. Student decoding speed is the first accommodation. Decoding speed is the speed at which students can decode words and can be measured by a standardized individualized assessment such as the Woodcock-Johnson Educational Assessment or the KTEA. If a student has a lower decoding speed, then the student may require additional time to complete readings. The student's processing speed is also worthy of consideration. Processing speed is the efficiency of the mind to complete a task. The processing speed is measured using a cognitive skills individual assessment such as the WISC. Again, if the student's processing speed is significantly lower than average, the student may need additional time to complete assignments.
Although there are benefits to extended time for students who process at a slower rate or who perform at a slower rate on assessments, this is not always the best option for classroom assignments. When students are provided with extended time for classroom assignments, they are perpetually behind. Extended time for daily classroom assignments can be detrimental to students with organizational struggles. If these students struggle to complete work within current parameters, and many times they are unable to provide themselves with new parameters, and assessments are left undone. According to the DSM-V, students with learning disabilities diagnosis can display inaccurate or slow and effortful word reading. Students with a diagnosis of ADHD often have difficulty organizing tasks and activities, often with difficulty following through on instructions, according to the American Psychiatric Association. Many other students with other mental illnesses can also struggle with organizational skills. So if a student has fewer file cabinets in their head, then the most beneficial accommodation for these students would be geared toward the addition of these virtual file cabinets. If the student struggles with reading, then perhaps learning to budget time early for reading or taking the time to use a test voice program would have additional benefit rather than an open-end extended time accommodation.
Rather than provide students with extended time, which is a reactionary approach to classwork, a more proactive approach can be of an enormous benefit. According to Finstein, Yang, and Jones, students can benefit from direct instruction in organization as well as guided practice, communicating with instructors, as well as making up calendars and checklists. Strategies that teach students to front-load rather than back-load are particularly useful. Basically, this strategy provides students with the ability to begin tasks early. Time has to come from somewhere. Why not have it come from the time before an assignment is due? Some excellent tools to benefit students can really help. For example, a planner or agenda can be a lifesaver for disorganized students. Also, most phones have a calendar app, which makes planning easy. Taking the time at the beginning of class, or a week, or even at the beginning of a day to budget time will allow students the added time that they need without the student being perpetually behind. Text alerts such as Remind.com or even phone alarms can be a very useful tool in learning to budget time. Having that bell sound, or, like mine, a barking dog, can help the student budget their time more effectively. It really should be no surprise that support from a facilitator or mentor is incredibly helpful. Think of all the programs that use this type of support. Weight Watchers, for example, has mentors and facilitators to help with weight loss support. There is an accountability aspect that tends to motivate the students with access to this type of aid.
An optimal plan for students for developing organizational skills would be one in which students meet an advisor several days a week to discuss ways to budget time and develop a plan to break up assignments. In these meetings, the students' abilities and needs would be discussed, such as needing more time to complete readings for a given course, and additional time would be allotted. For example, at West Lane University, students with disabilities can opt for a daytime check-in. This service helps students develop a plan for budgeting time to complete all requirements for academic life, from larger written assignments to classroom reading. With providing this type of support, students can begin to learn these valuable survival strategies that are so desperately needed. As the student experiences success, the frequency of meetings is reduced. This is not a, "Oh good, you completed your tasks for an entire week, you're done," but more of a long-term by-semester determination. On the long term, the student takes accountability for budgeting time and finding ways to manage their own needs for success, which is the long-term goal. As educators, rather than providing a student with short-term band-aid, open-ended extended time, it is critical to provide students with the skills and then the opportunity to utilize these problem-solving skills before the students are in the workplace. According to the National Association of Colleges and Employers, in their Job Outlook 2016 survey, one of the highest rated skills that employers want in new hires is problem-solving skills at 70.2%. Lower down on the list, but still in the 60% range, is analytical quantitative skills and adaptability flexibility. By providing students with the mentality that they are not required to meet deadlines, we are ultimately setting them up for failure in the workplace, where a deadline is a deadline regardless of the time it will take to complete a task. Instead of using a one-size-fits-all approach, we need to be considering the desired outcome for each student and implementing accommodations carefully and thoughtfully, not just providing the students with help running the race in the short term, but actually acting as coaches and providing the student with the training that they will need in the race in the long term.
According to the National Center for Education Statistics, the number of students diagnosed with disabilities is slowly increasing at the post-secondary level. And more often, colleges are being held responsible for the ultimate employability of their graduates. At this point, 30 states now have policies that connect some state funding to the performance of public colleges, as well as to their graduation rates and their annual growth. These students require added support and education, but also need the skills required by employers. According to Finstein, Yang, and Jones, students can benefit from direct instruction and organization, as well as guided practice, communicating with instructors, and making up calendars and checklists. By learning to manage and regulate their daily activities, students may achieve more positive and productive outcomes, such as academic success, job retention, and employer satisfaction.
The primary goal of schools is success in the long term for our students. Students with special needs require additional support, but also need the tools to be successful. Providing students so close to their careers with accommodations should not only be supportive for the student while in college, but also support their post-secondary goals.